So welcome. My name is Charlie Crabtree, and I am right now the Fourth Corner. And I put out a newsletter and have a blog online, and it's called thefourthcorner.com. And yeah, thank you. There's my crowd. And if you can get a chance to take a look at it and subscribe to it, it's free subscription. That would be good because I do a little bit of the sponsorship of these kind of events. Dick Donahue and Common Threads does the majority of the sponsorship to put on these forums and events and information. So what I'd like to do now is call up Gary Hagelin, who is a former Air Force, who knows what an E7 is, Master Sergeant, to lead us in the flag salute. If you guys can stand up and join us. Where are you? Here you go.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Gary. So this evening, something else I would like to do is, if we have, and we do, I think, have candidates or candidates to be, filing week hasn't happened yet, but we do have people who have kind of signed on to run this year in county races. I would like them to stand up, and I'll pop around and get your names and what you're running for. So, sir, and sir, if you could stand. Anybody that's running for office this fall? Is there anybody? Okay, and your name, sir?
My name is Herb Porter, running for City Council, position number 1.
In Ferndale. And you, sir?
My name is Ben Lawson, I'm running for County Council, District 5. In Council for Ferndale.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else? And then the next thing I would like to do is introduce, if anybody else is in the room, those that are involved, Carl is, with Common Threads, if they could just kind of rise and be recognized. These guys work hard to bring you these presentations amongst many other things. We'll announce some of those things going on. There's Dick Donahue, there's Carl Upiano, I don't know. What is it? How do you say it? Upiano. Okay, and a whole bunch out in the lobby. So that's kind of what we do. And I'm going to announce this twice, once being now. But there are events that we're going to put on. One we're going to put on May 23rd. And that is a Thursday. It will be at the ferry terminal. And it's all about the future of fishing and the seafood industry in Whatcom County. And there'll be some inclusion of talking about hatcheries and saving the orca. And we'll have, hopefully, some, I think a port commissioner or two, and it's going to be another good tour. And that one will be on the 23rd at the ferry terminal. We'll let you know. Subscribe to the Fourth Corner, subscribe to Common Threads, and we'll put out the information on that as soon as everything is finalized. It's about taxes, ain't it? Yeah, it's that kind of thing. So moving on, what we're going to do tonight a little bit is talk about what effect and where we stand with taxes. And I mean at any level, whether it be the local level, the state level, and not so much the national level. So one of the things that I've found out just lately and put out in my latest issue is that, guess what? We are tied for what they call Tax Freedom Day. That means absolutely every tax that we're taxed per capita, we are tied with California at 38 out of 50, 50 being the worst. So we are doing things like California in some ways. it doesn't just really seem to be the right way. The next thing that happened today, as I was coming over here, I got a call from the Senate floor of the State House, and amendments were being turned down by the Democrats in that Senate to change what they call the MOTCA tax, or the toxic chemical spill cleanup tax. Right now, it's at 69 cents. It's going to go up. This affects our refineries. It's going to go up 62%. Now, the refineries will get some of that back by selling local fuel, but they won't get the stuff back that they export. And so it's another attack by taxation on the counties, North Whatcom County and Skagit County. So this is kind of what we're going to talk about tonight, is why do we have this need for all of this gobs of money? We've got an actual 14% more money came into the state coffers than they budgeted over the last 2 years, and they want more. And they keep passing tax after tax. They'll be voting on the capital gains tax. They'll be voting on another carbon tax. And it's just something that we want you to be aware of, that we want you to pass on, and what's going on here in Whatcom County and throughout the state. So we've set up a program where we're going to be talking to 3 or 4 people that are all knowing about all these subjects. And I'm going to name them off, and then I'll introduce them one by one as they come up and speak. So we're going to have County Assessor Keith Willenauer, and he's going to come up and talk about what he does and how certain things are affected by what he does. And then we're going to have a fellow by the name of Ron Wiesen. And Ron Wiesen is a commissioner out of Skagit County. He's going to come up and talk about the challenges they had in building a county jail, getting her done, and getting it up and running. And then we're going to have something new to our forum format, and it's going to be called a hotspot. And I don't know how many of you know, and it's going to be a little off subject, know what's going on with the Department of Ecology and wells in this county again and still. So we got a hotspot for a couple minutes on that subject, and we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to move right into a panel discussion between Glenn Morgan and our friend from the Washington Policy Center, David Bose, is the communication director. And they'll be talking about state taxes. So let's get started without further ado. I would like to, and I have the privilege of introducing our county assessor here, Keith Willenauer. And Keith has been elected 8 times. That's just, I had no idea. I thought it was like yesterday when he started serving. And he's served now for 30 years, since 1989. And he is going to retire from this veil of tears in the county assessor's office this year. He is a Bellingham property owner, and he's married. His wife's name's Cindy, and he has a 21-year-old son, Jack. And he was educated here at Western Washington University, and I hope he graduated from high school before that, but yes. And so he's going to come up and talk a little bit about the county assessor's job, how they value our property and property taxes. Keith.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. And thanks to everybody to be here tonight. I heard a number of the advertisements all week on the radio, and I know how volatile the topic of taxes can be. I've been here for 30 years, and I certainly can appreciate and respect that this is really where we see the rubber meet the road. Our taxes go directly to the people that we expect to provide the things back to us that we have come to need and demand in our communities. And so taxes are a very important thing. And unfortunately, they take all sorts of different personalities. In my case, you know, I'm entirely focused, obviously, on property tax. Property tax is, you know, certainly not the only tax, and in fact, it could be said that we have some other larger taxes. We pay a lot of sales tax. You know, businesses pay a lot of B&O tax. We pay taxes every day. You take a look at your telephone bill and you'll see taxes in there. You'll see taxes to the federal government. Taxes, taxes, taxes. I am just going to stay kind of focused on property tax. But I will try to make some comparison, and I will try to bring property tax and taxes in general into focus. And the thing I can say about taxes is that it's an agenda in the legislature, and tax policy is something that I think everybody here is concerned about, and is something I'm concerned about. And even though I am retiring as assessor, I will remain concerned about tax policy in the state of Washington. So we'll start off here in the assessor's world. Anybody who's seen my slideshow at any point over 30 years, you'll know I always refer to this slide. This is my Let's Focus on History slide. And this is a tomb painting from ancient Egypt, and it's a tomb painting about a delinquent taxpayer and a punished taxpayer in the tomb of Mena. And what it says there, and if you read that very closely, it says, you know, a punished taxpayer, some sort of a disagreement about the assessment has caused the taxpayer to be cast to the ground and bludgeoned by the collector. Just to show you how long people have hated the assessor, way back, way back. I had another slide that I used to refer to that kind of said, you know, the very, you know, the oldest profession that people generally think of, you know, probably took place in a house that was being taxed by the assessor. So this is where we go. Okay, ready? Next slide. Okay, the role of the office, pretty straightforward. First item, you know, the assessor is in charge of providing the uniformity and fairness in the distribution of property tax. And these are big words for the assessor community. These are big words for all of the elected officials in the state. You know, the most important thing I think we kind of focus on, you know, is the idea of uniformity and fairness. Tax is an abuse. It always seems like an abuse. Any tax you pay is always more than you want to pay. But when it is an abuse and it's uniform and fair, it has a higher quality, and assessors are committed to that. And the way we do that is we appraise all property as to its true and fair market value, because property tax in Washington state is an ad valorem tax. It means you are taxed based on the value of your property, the property you hold in the community that you're paying the taxes to. Okay, next. And in doing that, we have to maintain a listing and description of property accounts, maps, and ownerships. We have to know what we're taxing, and we have to be able to value it. So in doing that, we maintain a huge database, and this is where we see most of our public involvement, is in the fact that when people want to know anything about property or what's going on with property, then they look to the assessor and the assessor's records. And last but not least, we provide taxpayer assistance, and that's hopefully kind of why I've been elected 8 times, because hopefully I've been providing a quality of taxpayer assistance that you would expect from an elected official. Okay. What don't I do? Okay, let's see what the first thing is here. I don't set or determine property tax policy. So right now, your legislature, scary as it is down there in session, and your legislature is setting and determining property tax policy. They write laws for the state of Washington, and then the assessor must perform under those laws, and those laws dictate and determine property tax policy, so pay attention. Okay, The assessor does not raise values to raise money or taxes. So the fact of keeping up with a market with assessed values for property and keeping in connection with that market, either up or down, is just to say in connection to it to describe the distribution of tax. And it's distributed based on the relative value of your property to the values of other properties. And when properties go up and down in value, this does not raise more revenue for the districts. That's a misnomer. And the assessor doesn't determine how much money is needed. So this is a kind of the hidden beauty in Washington's property tax structure, is that the budgets are what determine how much money is needed. So each taxing district comes to their own legislative conclusion about how much money it takes to provide fire protection for Sudden Valley. The fire district has a public hearing and they decide what it's going to cost to provide that protection. They create that budget, they bring that budget to the assessor, and they tell the assessor, collect that money from all your taxpayers. And the assessor's job is to distribute who's going to pay what share of that budget. And so that's the effect of the tax base. The tax base distributes which share of the already determined budget you are going to pay. And so simply put, if your property's worth twice as much in that fire district, you're going to pay twice the share, and inversely the other way around. So those are property tax basics. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Tonight I'm going to talk about, go ahead, let's see. I'm going to try to bring a comparable perspective, okay? Again, and a tax policy relevance, excuse me. And so I'm going to try to put property tax into a discussion about how it's involved with other taxes, what other taxes are there, and then try to bring a perspective about that to anywhere else people are paying property taxes, and then as well try to talk about some tax policy relevance and whether or not you're paying more than you should or less than you should next. Okay, and we're going to talk about property tax impact subject awareness, because there are a lot of things affecting what tax it is you do pay, and I'll try to run through some of those. And then last but not least, I'm going to be here to answer any questions and to create an opportunity to dialogue for any clarity or any questions you have. And even if we run out of time, I'll still be here and you can speak to me after tonight. That's what I do. I try to answer those questions. Okay? Let's start with, again, what I told you before. We have a budget-based property tax system in Washington State. It's not that way all over the country. Some states don't have budget-based property tax system. But in a budget-based property tax system, the dollars come first. They're preset. The districts determine what they're going to spend. They come up with a budget. They say they need $1 million, and that's what's going to be collected, regardless of what happens to the assessed values. If the assessed values go up, then the rate goes down. Assessed values go down, then the rate goes up. But the $1 million is going to be collected because it's set by the budget. And assessed values distribute the individual taxpayer burdens of preset dollar amounts. The point we depart here is something I'm going to talk about tonight more and more. You'll hear me say it. And this is something the state did in 2017. They radically changed tax policy in the state of Washington because in the state's portion of property tax, they dropped the budget-based property tax system, and they tied the tax to a rate. And when you tie the tax to a rate, now when assessed values go up and down, you simply pour money through the door and say you didn't know what you were doing, and it's the assessor who made that happen. So this is very disconcerting to the assessment community, very disconcerting to anybody who really understands tax policy, and just goes to show you that the legislature doesn't listen to me. You know, Again, in the budget-based system, increased taxes do not create tax revenue, except see the exception above, which is now the state has decided that they don't want any part of that otherwise high-quality tax policy in the state of Washington. They'd rather enforce a new deal on us, okay? So here's the formula in a budget-based system. You have the budget, you divide it by the tax base, and you equal a rate. In the budget-based tax system, this all works out really well, but if you lock in the rate, then the formula changes. And again, then as the assessed value increases, so does the revenue. This is, by the way, what some people might know as the precursor to Proposition 13 in California. This is what we know from national and international tax policy is the doom of property tax as you know it, and leads property tax ultimately to where it is in California, which is, if anybody lived there or does live there or knows anything about it, that you'd know that's not where you want to be. Let's move on. This just describes it again. You know, everybody pays a different amount to equal the authorized tax amount. When that happens, then, you know, the assessor's just responsible for distributing the burden, not really responsible for how much money is going to be collected, okay? Let's move on. And so under that scenario, if we weren't changing it somewhat for the state of Washington, here's what's good about property tax. You know, I'm up here trying to tell you guys, you know, you're all seething, I'm sure, with property tax volatility, but property tax is really wonderful. It's really great. It's, you know, as a revenue generator, it really works well, and if it's done right, it's not a bad tax. You don't have to applaud or anything. That's a lot of people ask me if I have a religious connection to property tax, and I tell them no, I don't really at all. But it is controllable, and that's what I was saying. You know, I mean, you can limit all sorts of the elements in property tax. You can limit it by participating at the budget. You can limit it by participating at the ballot box, and you can limit it, you know, by just legislatively enforced limitations which keep it under control. Okay, next. It's dependable, that's right. You know, I mean, in 2008, you know, the economy collapsed, everything, you know, dumped, the real estate market, you know, plummeted, sales tax revenue went through the basement, you know, and local governments just almost could not function. Much of the state of Washington came very close, you know, to outright economic collapse in the governmental world. But property tax didn't falter at all. Property tax continued to stay vital. It stayed stable, and it was the sole and most dependable part of the revenue stream for government, and it held the whole show together. Okay? Okay, it's progressive. I hear all day long about the regressive nature of tax in Washington State. Yes, altogether, tax is regressive, but in no way at all is property tax regressive. Property tax is progressive. If you are holding a house that's worth twice as much as your neighbor's house, you're paying twice the tax that they are. And so there is no break for the rich or the wealthy. It doesn't go backwards. It does not adversely impact anybody. It's about as progressive as you can get. Unless, of course, you're able to acquire special interest exemption of some kind. Okay, next. It's sensible. Sensible by the fact that if we're talking about 100% market values, and you can look at the values of your neighbors and yourself, and you know what the budgets are and you're participating, it all makes sense. It's 100%. You know whether if you're paying more than your share or less than your share, and so it creates a transparency for citizens that is amiable in a revenue-generating stream. You don't get that opportunity in much of the other tax you're paying. You don't know what's going on in sales tax or why you're paying this or where it's going and, how do you affect that? You just pay it and get the heck out of there, okay? And it's accountable, okay? That's also what I'm saying, it's accountable. If you don't like the services you're getting, or if you think you're paying too much and not getting your money's worth, you have the ability to go enforce an accountability on those people who are supposed to be doing it for you. So if you don't like, the way the Meridian School District is operating, then you can go to the Meridian School District's school board meeting and you can talk to them about what's going on with your property tax and hold them directly accountable. Try to do that with sales tax and a couple of other kind of situations, and you're not going to see that. And conversely, if you don't like the fire district, or if you don't like the sheriff's office, or if you don't like the things that are affecting you directly in your community, most of them are funded primarily by property tax, and you do have that ability to hold your local people accountable to those services versus the revenue and the revenue stream that's being used to fund them. So that's what's good about property tax, okay? And here's 3 reasons in this whole deal why taxes increase, okay? First of all, taxing districts can increase their budgets just by meeting and having a public hearing. So the county council gets together or the city council gets together or the fire district or your cemetery district, they all get together at some point and they have a public hearing and they say, we're going to figure out what we're going to do with our property tax, and they can increase their property tax, but it's limited to 1%. So they can only increase from year to year by 1%. And that's what I'm talking about. That's a restraint that keeps property tax from going through the roof, that holds the show together, and it creates that stability we were talking about. So they decide whether or not they're going to take their 1% or not. And you'll see that when the city of Bellingham gets together and they publicly announce that they intend to take their 1%, and they have that meeting, they have to move that meeting from City Hall over to the Bellingham High School because everybody shows up. Why? Because they want to discuss whether or not 1% is appropriate or 1% is reasonable, okay? And then now we have the state school exception, which kind of says, okay, that's not working like that quite anymore for the state because they didn't. They exceeded 1%. They decided to just foist a whole new deal on everybody because they wanted to fund education and fix the McCleary decision. And so they've kind of gotten themselves out of this whole realm, okay? Then we have voters. Voters can authorize increases, and they do repeatedly. They do routinely. So when you see a voter item on your ballot, I don't know, a bond issue or affordable housing tax or greenways levy or any number of these items, they come to you, to voters, just the voters in that district, and they say, do you guys want to tax yourself out of some more money to support these things? And then they ask voters to vote for them. And of course, not one voter who ever talks to me ever voted for any of those things. But they seem to pass pretty routinely, okay? And then last but not least, how your taxes can increase, and this is what I'll talk about, they can increase from a tax base shift. So within that tax base, if one kind of property is gaining value and the other property is not gaining value as fast as possible, then we're seeing that burden shift. And that burden can shift for any number of reasons inside the tax base. And whenever anything is happening, there are winners and losers. So somebody wins, but somebody loses. Why? Because we're going to collect the same $1 million one way or the other, and so you hear me talk about a tax base shift. What happens in a tax base shift? If somebody loses a whole lot of value, everybody else who didn't lose that value takes up the slack and gets a tax increase in order to cover the hole. The districts don't collect less money, they just distribute it to whoever else is still left. So anytime you hear about exemptions or impacts on the tax base, assessors are acutely aware of tax base shift as a way that property taxes can get out of control and be an effect on people. Okay? Let's go on. Couple of slides here. I'm going to bring some statistics in. I know how boring it is. I try to make them look funny so that you can get a sense of what's going on here. This is simply the assessed value change of most of the properties in Whatcom County. It's really just describing the real estate market over a 30-year period here. And it started off, it went way high, property taxes doubled, then it dropped back down, then went back up, came back down, went back up. And we, of course, are over here in 2019, and I think all of you know, we've had a rising market for the last 5 years, and assessed values have been increasing. Can't do anything about that. That's just what happens. I have to follow wherever that market goes, but it's not affecting your property tax. It's just affecting the value of your property. Yes, you're getting rich. That's what I keep telling my wife. We're getting rich, look. But we're not seeing any of it. Okay, next. What I'm more interested in is the levy, which is how much money are we collecting? What are the budgets doing? How are voters reacting? Who is getting way more money? How much money are we collecting? And the thing I'm pointing out about this chart here is that way back in 1991, we were still stuck in this 6% limitation world, and at 6% and with a lot of school levying, we were still in a very high increase of property tax every year. And then somebody, Tim Eyman, who shall remain nameless, came along and said, look, the cost of living is only 1%. And we're, if we keep increasing at 6%, we'll be California. And at some point, you cannot let property tax increase faster than your taxpayers have an ability to pay. Because sooner or later, that's trouble in property tax land. So what happened? We came down, we got a 1% limitation, Initiative 74, then some legislation there, and we saw everything slowly stabilize and stay relatively stable until, just coming up here in 2017 when the state did what they did and they just rocketed the order of levy, with a 58% increase. And so there's where we're going. We're rocketing up that final couple of years. Let's just say I don't want to be at the other end of that chart if it keeps going. Okay, so let's go to the next slide and I'll show you what really did happen. Oh, that's the same chart except with 2019's year added. Well, what happened in 2019? To some degree, this is why I'm retiring, because I think the world has gone crazy because taxes went down. They went down. I'd had to listen for 30 years that taxes never go down. And I would say, well, values go down. I've seen values go way down and way up and way down a couple of times. But you're right, I'd never in 30 years seen taxes actually go down. They went down almost 7%. In 2019. Different rates for different people, but altogether, as much property tax as we collect totally, it went down. So that changes that trajectory. So now you can see that trend line doesn't look as bad as it did in the slide before because, we did something. By the way, what we did was we affected the legislature and they all had to get reelected. And so they realized that money was pouring through the door faster than they could even get a hold of it and that it was coming unglued. And so they'd better do something. And so they decided that they would reduce the state's levy from 270 down to 222. And boom, there we go, okay? So let's move on. Let's go right back through this. You guys seen this. I'm just trying to enforce this one more time, just so you get it. Now let's talk about, about the tax base shift. Okay, let's move on. Okay, when the levy does increase, where does that increase come from? So I took 15 years here and I looked at 117% of increase over 15 years. Yeah, that's quite a bit, blah, blah, blah. But where'd it come from? Who did the increasing? Okay? And the increase came mostly from voted approved additions. So every time you voted to approve some more taxes, you want this, you want that, you want some more, you were adding your own burden to it. It wasn't property tax doing itself. And then the other 36.7%, that was an increase from new construction. So the districts get additional revenue when they have new construction in their district. And when they get that new construction, the people who pay that are the people with the new construction. So that doesn't get passed on to other taxpayers. So most of all of this increase is in either you voted for it or it was increased at 1%, okay? So let's move on. So now let's take a look at some comparable statistics. Here's some 2017 tax statistics for where we rank in the country. We're looking at the Washington State median home value property tax. A median home, it goes up and down, so this is kind of an attempt to get relative. It's $26.31 for a median home, depending on which state you live in, and Washington ranks 12th, okay? In Whatcom County, let's see, where am I at here? Got my own. Okay, in Whatcom County, in the state of Washington, we're at 2173, and we rank 9th out of the 39 counties in Washington state. So that's hopefully an attempt to try to get us into a comparative world. All right, next. What is your property tax as a percent of median income? Because in some counties, they're earning way more than we are here, let's just say King County or whatnot. Well, we equalize that out, and we pay 3.65% in the state relative to the other states, and we're 11th in the country. And in Whatcom County, we're at 3.36, which means we're below Washington State's average, and that puts us... Well, I couldn't figure out where we ranked in the state because I couldn't get everybody's statistics, but I know, I knew what Whatcom counties were. Okay, next. So now let's compare increases. What kind of order of levy increases were in the state of Washington? Well, in the state, the overall state increased all its property tax by 14.7%, and we increased ours by 14.42. So we're not even yet at the average of the state of Washington and in Whatcom County. Okay, let's see another statistic. How about schools? Well, they increased 23% in the state of Washington, and we only increased 21.35%. Okay, let's move on. Now the county current expense part. What is the county doing with its current expense budget? Statewide county current expense budgets increased by 6.10%, and we only increased 3.79%, and I'll give our county a whole lot of credit. We are very conservative in county property tax levying comparability. And then the cities themselves, well, they didn't fare so well. The cities overall in the state went up 3%, and our cities went up 3.75%. In the fire districts, overall 9.10, and our fire districts only went up 5. So, comparatively, Whatcom County is not pushing the envelope in property tax. In fact, it's staying below the state average. It's staying fairly fiscally conservative, so to speak. And overall, that's the point here in all of this. And not only that, not just the county, but all of the county's districts. Okay? So I'm going to kind of jump. Let's move on. This is our entire tax bill. I guess what I'm saying here is that almost 2/3 of our tax bill goes to schools. The two largest sections there are the state school and the local schools. I'm out of time here, so there's a buzzer going off. Okay, let's. I want to see if I can get to my next slide here. Let's keep going. And this one there, property tax is lower than everybody else. I'm trying to get to the most important part here, which is more discussions about tax impact. So, here's what's going on in property tax. Property tax is just so volatile, and everybody likes to use it politically, and what's going on. And the point I'm making in this slide is property tax is just in the way. There's a big policy debate in the state of Washington, and property tax is just doing too good. It's too dependable, it's too understandable, it's too all of those things. And ultimately what you have is that when somebody wants to change tax policy, they have to create a crisis. And if they create a crisis, then property tax is in the way. And it's a lightning rod for political exposure and all of these situations. And at the same time, they can blame the fact that the market values are moving, so they needed to incorporate that. Okay, let's move on. And what is happening in the tax base? We have different kind of land uses that may or may not be correct. We want to support one thing and not the other. We have interference from alternative taxes. They're coming on board. Lots of special purpose stuff. We have exemption expansions where more and more people aren't paying any tax at all while others are paying more. And then we have, of course, the legislative agenda, which I don't know what they're doing down there. So here, however, are the specific impacts that we're seeing in property tax. These are where we had shifts in the tax base. We had a big thing at Semiahmoo, we had Sudden Valley, we had Hearst. All of these things were disrupting the market values of properties and sending taxes away from one part and on to others. Then we have nonprofits who are expanding their exemptions. The biggest nonprofit shift we saw was in Peace Health in Bellingham. Go ahead. Then we have senior citizens. As taxes get more and more outrageous, seniors want more and more relief. I'm not discounting that, but I'm just saying when they do, that shifts burden. Then we have tribal fee to trust. We have exemptions for the tribes, putting massive kind of commercial endeavors into trust, and that takes it right off the tax base. Then we have multifamily historical property. They're getting massive new tax exemptions, pushing that burden onto residential property owners. We have low-income affordable housing. They're doing the same thing. Everybody wants a break, and everybody else has to pay. And then we get to Cherry Point. And then we have Cherry Point where when you're affecting the property values and reducing assessed values in Cherry Point, the impact on that is dynamic. So you put all those together and property tax is taking a hit, and we need to kind of take a look at tax policy. So in Cherry Point in specific, I wanted to take a look at one statistic here that was kind of valuable. First of all, BP is Whatcom County's #1 taxpayer. It's almost double #2, which is Phillips, but two huge taxpayers in Whatcom County, and then they're currently operating on massive amounts of land at not very much impact. So both of those areas have, multi-thousands of acres of undeveloped land around them. So Cherry Point is at a fraction of its potential. And then what we have coming up is the tax base shift. So I was asked to kind of take a look at, okay, what's going to happen? What happens if, let's just say somehow you affected a 50% loss in the market value of 3 properties at Cherry Point? The 3 properties being, Conoco, BP, and Telco. And if they lost 50% of their assessed value, that would shift, close to $400,000 a year in tax to a median valued property in the area that those are, the Cherry Point area, the Ferndale School District, the Blaine School District. And then it'd be about $100 of increase to everybody else in the county. Now that's just one kind of item, and that's not the total loss of their value. That's just a 50% loss in their value. So that's how it works. When you take property off the roll, when you move the tax base in one direction or another, that shifts the tax burden on everybody else, and that's how we all pay extra for the same things that we've been using. So I'm gonna close that out. I know Charlie's been trying to get me off here, but I wanted to get to that point because I think that's the most important point about the impact on taxes altogether, is that you need to be extremely aware of tax policy, and you need to be paying attention to the health of your tax base, because the healthier your tax base is, then the better your community is. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very informative. Thanks. I'm gonna miss you. You gotta run again now. Okay. Thanks very much. We've got a hot spot going here, and a fellow that's going to come up and have a little statement about our water issues here in Whatcom County. Take a very short time. Is Dave Uncles. And Dave has been involved in these issues from the very get-go. I've been in meetings where Dave is quite the passionate guy. We love his passion and we like him. So he's going to give us a little overview of what's going on with the Department of Ecology and the county water system. So I'm going to let you explain it all in a minute and a half.
Thanks, Charlie. Well, one thing I know, and that's if you want to shift taxes from your property to another piece of property, one good way is to have somebody deprive you of the use of a well to furnish water to the house on your property. And that was the effect of the County Council's action in response to the Hearst decision. And if you recall, Hearst and some of his pals petitioned the Growth Management Hearings Board about Whatcom County's comprehensive plan, asserting that the comprehensive plan contained insufficient protections for water quantity and quality in Whatcom County. After a series of court battles, Whatcom County lost and the petitioners prevailed, and the Washington State Supreme Court found that, they remanded the case to the hearings board. And in a paroxysm of panic and overreach, the Whatcom County Council, over the no vote of Barbara Brenner, voted to impose a moratorium on the use of permit-exempt groundwater wells for new residential uses in Whatcom County, and followed that with a series of additional moratoria. In response, the Washington State Legislature in 2017 passed ESSB 6091, the Hearst Fix Bill, which reestablished permit-exempt domestic well use, water use from permit-exempt domestic wells, as a beneficial use, a permitted use in rural Whatcom County and other counties in Washington State. And in addition, it required the initiating governments in WIRA 1, Whatcom County, the City of Bellingham, and PUD number 1 to engage in an update process for the watershed management plan in WIRA 1, and to finish that process by February 1st, 2019. The Department of Ecology and the lead agency, Whatcom County, worked together to mismanage this process and make it an extremely difficult thing to accomplish. In the end, an update to the watershed management plan crafted by the Land Development Caucus was scuttled by the Department of Ecology. And so you might have heard that the planning unit failed, but what really happened was that the Department of Ecology killed the planning unit's efforts. I don't think I'm being unkind. So, the result of that supposed failure of the planning unit was that the Department of Ecology is now, in accordance with the statute, engaged in rulemaking. And the rule that they're amending in this process is what's called WAC 173-501, the Nooksack in-stream flow rule. Whereas legislation allowed consumption of 3,000 gallons per day per permit exempt well for indoor domestic use, and an unlimited amount of water to be used for watering of up to 1/2 acre of landscape. The proposed rule, which was just published by the Department of Ecology, would limit indoor consumption to 500 gallons a day and outdoor domestic water use, they call it, to 1/12 acre. Now that's a 3,333 square foot lawn and garden. You can put as much water on it as you wish, depending on how you interpret the language in the proposed rule, which is ambiguous, to be kind. And so recently, that is Tuesday, the Department of Ecology had some open houses for discussion of this proposed rule, and 3 Department of Ecology employees traveled to Ferndale, Linden, and to the ecology site at Bayview to listen to WIRO 1 residents and to hear their concerns about the proposed rule. To Ecology's consternation, 100 people showed up in a room designed for about 75 in Ferndale, and 150 appeared in Linden in a room designed for 100. And not everybody was very happy with the proposed rule. So the result is that they got an earful from outraged rural residents, and they've gone back to Olympia to reconsider their rule. And we'll see what appears. But comment on the rule change, the proposed language is to be accepted by Ecology until May 10th. And there's a website, an Ecology website, at which you can, you're going to give them a link? Great, thank you. You can learn more about this out at the Caper desk in the hallway, where there's a handout titled "Your Water Rights Are Still at Risk" that explains this a little more clearly than I might have, forgetful me. And if any of you has a question that I might answer, feel free to approach me and I'll be happy to chat with you about it. CAPER is the Citizens Alliance for Property Rights.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Anything that we're talking about here tonight is going to be on the commonthreadsnorthwest.org website, and it will be on the fourthcorner.com, including Keith's presentation and the links to his website, the county treasurer's website, and David and the water issues that are going on that are just it's totally amazing at this particular point. So we're going to continue on with the evening, and I'm going to introduce Ron Wiesen to you. Ron, you get the time that we planned to have, so you just go and do what you were going to do. Ron Wiesen is a Skagit County Commissioner. He's serving what year? 12 years? 11 years? 11 years as commissioner in Skagit County. They have a 3-commissioner system, not a council system like Whatcom County. He's been, his family and he are 4th generation farmers and business people in Skagit County. He's very well connected to the community. I'm a former school board member, so the line of his leadership list that got to me was that he was on the committee for the Burlington Edison School District on vocational education planning for that district. So he's been involved up and down on the community standards. He's going to talk to us a little bit tonight about the challenge that they had in Skagit County to get a new jail, why they needed a new jail. I'm going to ask him all these questions up front. And then how that proceeded and how we got to have a new facility in Skagit County. So Ron.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here today. I was asked to come and talk about our Skagit County Jail, what the process was. Go to the next slide here. And so we had a grand opening and ribbon cutting on July 11th, 2017. And it was a long process to get where we were. I was elected in November of 2008. And that was right before the downturn in the economy and so forth. And at that time, we ended up laying off about 1/3 of our planning department. Other people in our staff had to get laid off because we just didn't have the funds mentioned, like because of the property tax was on our stabilization, but the income tax or the sales tax was not there. We had a vote in November of 2003 for our jail facility at that time. And at that time, it failed by a no vote of 61%. But when we went back again in August of 13, we had a yes vote of 73%. So the question is, what did we do? How did we make that happen? And how did we get this jail built? The next slide. One of the things we went out and looked at is what we need to do and how do we get the whole community behind it? How do we get the cities behind it? And how do we fund it? One thing with anything new jails, the roughly 20% of the cost of a jail is construction. The other 80% is operational. When I first came in the office, there were new jails that were built across the state and across the country that were sitting empty that are brand new because they didn't have enough money to fund the operation of the jail. So that was one thing we were really, really concerned about when going forward with this proposal. And we decided early on we were going to go for a sales tax lift of 0.3%. But to do that, you have to get agreement from all the different city councils, and you have to get the voters to approve it. And so that's really important what we try to do, make sure we were able to get the approval from all the different councils and the citizens to approve it. This shows all the different structures that we have inside our jail. One of the big things, we wanted to have a courtroom in the facility, wanted to make sure we had classrooms and so forth on the other side, and we wanted to make it so we could expand it in the future. We bought 10 acres where we ended up doing, and this section here is the housing. There's 7 different pods where the inmates can be housed, and then there's one here that's recreation, so it has a roof over or a screen over the top to get daylight. Over in the other corner up above here, there's classrooms. That was one thing we felt was really, really important. Make sure that the inmates had a program that can get GEDs and work with our junior college, Skagit Valley College, to help them get education and so forth coming out. One of the things that's really important to me is making sure people realize when you have people in jail that have mental issues or have drug or alcohol issues, you need to have a facility you can help treat them so when they do get out, there's something for them to do besides go out and cause trouble again and get thrown back into jail. The next slide. So how did we get there? One of the things we had to go out and so we set up a committee of the mayors, a county commissioner, 2 of the judges, and the sheriff, and trying to talk about all these different issues and try to figure out where we could come up with a good plan. We ended up looking at about 10 or 12 different sites across the county to decide where it could go, and we narrowed it down to 2 inside the city of Mount Vernon. Then we had to go through the whole essential public service process And so we had to show that we'd looked at all the different areas and come forward with a plan. We ended up with the two. One was just directly south of our Skagit Transit Station next to the freeway, and the other one was where we ended up building down at Truck City site. Both of them were industrial sites before, so the potential contamination. We chose to go to the Truck City site, which is a diesel fuel issue, so we had some cleanup we had to do there, but we were able to get through that with some of the MOFTA funds that we talked about earlier. Skagit County got about $1.1 million or $1.2 million to help with the cleanup on that. Ecology had been in there about 15, 20 years earlier and done a cleanup, but it wasn't complete, so we did our test wells and so forth, but evidently didn't put the test wells in the right spot, so they didn't find all the contamination. We started digging, so we had a little extra cost there, but the state DOE came in and helped cover some of those costs with the MOFA funds. Next slide. This is some of the issues. Our original jail that we had was built in '84, made for 43 inmates, or 83, excuse me. Then we expanded it by taking out some of the classrooms to make it up to 160 beds. Then we took out more classrooms and we got up to 120. And then in 2016, we had over 200 people in our jail. Basically, there was a north pod and a south pod and a classroom that used for the women's pod. So there wasn't any ability to separate the inmates, or when you got gangs, two different gang members in there, you couldn't put them in the same area because they just would fight, and it was very difficult for the officers, correction officers, to have a good look at the prisoners and see what was going on. So one of the issues when you go into the jail, the cities were responsible for their medical costs, and so we'd get some fights occasionally, and then they'd get the big medical bill, and the cities weren't happy with all that, how that affected their budgets. Next slide. So this is what we ended up with doing. Like I said, it was 72%. Next slide. So this is what the whole project ended up costing us, about $62 million. And as you can see, the construction costs and all the different things involved with that. We ended up going out for bonds. Our bonds were done right after the economy started. We were really lucky because the economy was still a little stagnant, and so the bids came in very favorable, and our bond ended up getting at 3.65% on the bonds. Next slide. These are some of the facts that are in the jail. It's an awful lot of cables. It was a tilt-up construction. The cement actually came in from Montana that was cheaper to truck it in. The walls and everything prefab to bring in, set up. And so there's a video showing how they built it over the 16, 18 months to build it. Next slide. And this is the ground or ribbon cutting that we had. All the cities were involved, the mayors, the sheriff, the prosecutor's office, all the commissioners. And one of the things, we had to get support from everybody. So we came up with a interlocal agreement with all the different cities. So in the new facility, because the citizens voted for the sales tax, the cities take their sales tax revenue, that 3/10, they bring it, send it to the county, and then the county uses that in a special fund just for the jail. And they do not have any bed rates anymore. They're not responsible for any medical costs. And so there's much smoother operation the way it's running. And we also have now the classrooms and so forth, so we have a drug and alcohol treatment. We're able to have a drug court that's going on. We are able to have college classes from Skagit Valley College, just able to come down and help with the GEDs and so forth. And so we have transition available for the inmates, so when they go out, there are other things they could do when they get out of the jail. One thing on our jails, the inmates are there for pretrial, or if they're sentenced after sentencing less than a year. And so some of them will be there for a short amount of time, some will be there for 2 or 3 years, depending on how long their trial or how many contingencies they get on their trial. So those are some of the things that go on that cost the jail, and I think we've been really successful. The jail now houses about 250 in right now, and like I said, we have it built, and so we can add another 400 in the next, whenever we need to do that, but we hope we don't have to do that because jails are very, very expensive, and it is a growth industry that has absolutely no revenue coming back to the city taxpayers and the county taxpayers. So that's about the highlights. I really want to thank you for letting us come here. I know it's real challenging, but we had to make some decisions that not everybody agreed with and not all the council people agreed with, but to make the program going forward, I think it was really important to have all the city councils and the county commissioners moving forward with a good plan and everybody agreeing with it. And some of the things we had to do, because Burlington is the highest per capita sales tax revenue in the state, we are actually giving them about $220,000 a year back from their sales tax to make them so they would agree to sign the agreement. Anacortes, another one of the smaller town, they got an extra $100,000 a year. We send back to them every year. Just try to make it simpler, and so everyone agree to come on board to make this happen. So once again, thank you very much for having me here. You got time for a question or two, or? Okay.
Yes, my question is, first of all, you have the sleeping areas, you call them pods, they're divided up like a pie. Do you have to have guards in the pods at all times?
If you can go back to that photo over, Ted, it's like a airport, sort of. The control tower is in the middle. So right here, elevated, and so there's glass all around, so you can stand there and see the whole area. And then there's 400 and some cameras all over too. They do not have to be physically in. The other thing we have is the hospital area there, and that area there, we're able to do some treatments on site. The other thing, the visitors, if they come in, up there they have just teleconferencing what it is. So we don't haul prisoners out to meet with family and so forth. They come out to court and talk to their lawyers and so forth. So that's the process of what we do there. Yes?
Did you increase your mental health services with this jail?
We increased the capacity to have services available, because before, all those different individual classrooms and so forth, we'd taken out and put bunks in, so we just couldn't even offer some of those facilities. So yes, we have more public support, or more different groups coming in and doing those services. Yes?
You had your first vote was 61% against.
Yeah.
You turned it around to 70+% yes. Yeah. What were the critical things that you folks did to get the voters turned around on that?
It was 10 years apart, and because the jail was so full, we were going to points where on Fridays, judge and the prosecutor would the people that we're going to kick out early, because we know it's going to get more people coming in, because we had a maximum capacity for the jail. So we were actually kicking people out. And so there were inmates or citizens out there who did bad things. They knew that this is the level of crimes they could do and they wouldn't get stuck in the jail. One of the funny stories is, after the new one opened, there was somebody did something wrong, Deception Pass, and he got pulled over, and he was arguing with the officer, says, "You don't got room to put me in jail." Well, the jail is open, so we took him to jail. And so when that happens, it immediately changed what the people who are doing bad things, because they realized immediately that they could go to jail, and so they changed up. And the other thing, once you come in and you're arrested, and the judge talks to you about the hold and so forth, and maybe they're released, they're supposed to come back into court, a week or 2 years or whatever it is later, and they just didn't show up. So then we had all these warrants that people had not bothered to show up in the courtroom, and so we had all these people that just knew that nobody could do anything about it.
Very much like an accident.
Yep.
Is there any provision for those that are released from parole, if you come back to the education program?
Are there any provisions who?
They're out of parole, can they come back in and start the class, start in the education program and that?
We're working with Skagit Valley College, and so some of the instructors are coming actually into the jail and helping but then when they get out, there's a program on the campus of Skagit Valley College, and so there are some previous prisoners that come back and talk to the current prisoners, and so they get that relationship, and so they're able to continue that at Skagit Valley College. Yes?
What's your capacity now and your capacity?
The new is 400 beds. One of the agreements we came to is when it gets up to 320 inmates, we'll have to go back and talk to the different cities and decide what we're going to do, if we're going to increase, because we could go up to 400. We've got kitchen space, but we have the ability to build another 400 on the same lot. So this 400-bed section here, we can plop it up there. And there's enough room in the kitchen and enough room for the medical and the intake and all that it's designed for that to happen. But we don't want that to happen because the cost of officers is a huge, huge draw on the whole program. Yes?
So I'm taking it when the new jail came in, you had an increased amount of people that were jailed because you had the capacity to. Then did that back off?
That was one of the concerns when we first started going through the process. Would the different cities go out and just do a warrant search and actually go out and look for people and pick them up? And so we've tried to temper that, and so they didn't just fill it up, and so it has not spiked. It's gone up a little bit, and it has kind of leveled off. But like I said, we're about 250 now. Yes.
How much has Whatcom County worked with your county to install a jail in Whatcom County? What's your perspective?
I know the sheriffs all work together, the chief of corrections and so forth work together. I mean, we only have 39 counties in the area, in the state, and we all try to work regionally with each other. And so we understand each other's issues. And when we were really crowded, we had prisoners, some up here and some over in Yakima and so forth, try to make it happen. And so one thing with local government or even farming or anything, you talk to people who've been successful and try to get good ideas and make it happen. And so I'm sure the communication is happening to see, but you've got to have the voters approve, and you've got to have the councils to make it a good message so the voters will approve it. If the voters see that there's disagreement going on, it's going to be very difficult to get the voters to approve it. And that's the key point. You have to get the voters to approve it. Yes?
For the corrections officer, is that fully staffed for that they need?
We are not fully staffed. We ramped up, but the corrections officers in an area where there seems to be always a turnover, and some of it is they get on because they're full officers, and then when a patrol position comes up, they may get robbed to go to some other county or city or something, and so there's a constant turnover. But one thing with the facility, they said there's a lot more walking than there used to be. But the other thing, it's much more safer for the correctional officers, and it's also safer for the inmates because we've got all the cameras, and so there isn't the chance of injury and so forth to go on. And so we've got several young ladies that are working as correctional officers there, and they haven't had any trouble. So we are looking if you know anybody wants a job. Anything else? Really want to thank you very much. I'll be around.
Great job. Okay, now we've had a little bit about our tax base, and we learned a lot about, I think, in my mind, for this whole forum, it's kind of a differentiation between what you do at the local level, which is mostly the changes in taxes are voted by the people, and what you do when you build a new jail is you've got to get your community behind you to vote locally to pay for a new jail. So from that, we're going to move on to the state. But first, a word from our sponsors. You knew it was coming. So Larry and Elizabeth and the guys, if you're ready, it takes a little bit of funding to put these forums together. We have Jensen, who is with Meridian High School, who in this case comes in and helps us with technology. We have Dave, who has more cameras than NBC. And we have the rental of the place and other small expenses. And if you could just help us out a little bit, there are some coffee-like cans that have been hours and hours in decorating so that they can take your donations. If you have a check or are going to write a check, it's to Common Threads Northwest. You can do that. There'll be a bucket also outside. So we're hopeful for your support tonight. We believe that we're doing something for the community that allows them to be educated and to We look forward to putting more of these on. As I said at the first part of the show, we're doing one May 23rd at the ferry terminal on fishing and seafood industry in Whatcom County. We hope that you can all attend that or tell people. We've had David Bowes arrive from the Washington Policy Center. He brought tons of good information, not tons, but a lot of information that you can take home with you. And we have to produce those kind of things. The county treasurer has left some good information. So please take as much information as you can and help us out if you can. It's important, I think, that we keep these things going. We try to get better and better at it and bring more and more people into the process. So thank you very much for any support you can. Remember also on the 23rd, we'll be talking a little bit about orca and fish hatcheries and how that whole system is either working to kill the salmon or save the salmon. We're never sure which in the last 30 years or so. That's right. We've already booked this wonderful facility here for October 17th. So any candidates can talk to Dick about putting that on their calendar, because we'll be here for everybody. It's a nonpartisan year. And we had a great one last year in both counties, actually, in Whatcom and Skagit County. So put that on your calendar for future reference. That's a long time away, I know, but it'll work out fine. So moving on, we're a little bit late about getting our last speakers on, and they're going to come on together. And I'll bring them up now if Glenn Morgan and David Bowes can come up. Glenn Morgan, you may know, is the executive director of CAPER, which is, what does CAPER stand for? Citizens Alliance for Property Rights. And formerly he has worked at the Freedom Foundation. David Bowes is the communications director for the Washington Policy Center out of, where's your office, Bellevue or Seattle?
We have offices in.
There you go. Yeah, good.
We have offices. We have offices in.
They worked before.
We have offices in Seattle, Spokane, Tri-Cities, and Olympia. I am usually in the Seattle office, unfortunately, because I live in Tacoma. It'd be so much easier to be in the Olympia office there.
And David formerly was a talk show fellow on KTTH and does a lot of writing for Northwest.
Well, Washington Policy Center pretty much occupies all my writing these days. I was a radio host in Seattle for many years, I think I was on the air in one capacity or another, about 16, 17 years in Seattle, somewhere in there, maybe 15, I can't remember now. But that was on KVI, and then KVI, I was a producer with Kirby Wilbur. I was the Grasshopper with Peter Weisbach. Then I went on to my own show on KTTH, did mornings and afternoons, and I filled in for Michael Medved many times, and a couple of other nationally syndicated folks some other times, and currently I fill in for the folks on KVI and Dory Monson on Cairo.
Okay, can you hear me through this thing? Okay, then I'll do it this way. The last thing I have as far as Glenn Morgan is concerned, I have in my hand, and they're listed back there, 41 results of his complaints to the Public Disclosure Commission. It might be interesting for people to know that we do have somebody who holds our politicians accountable for the money that they spend during their campaign times. And Glenn has done a great job over the years managing and handling that. Probably has got him in trouble in more ways than he ever thought possible. So I'm going to sit here and make sure that they don't fight each other. And they have chosen to talk about what they're going to talk about, hopefully on the state level as far as taxes are concerned. So again, I don't know if I announced this, but the Senate was passing the MACA tax, and maybe they'll talk about what that's all
that's a little hint of what it's like in Olympia right now. Since we've been here, I've had 2 email alerts of tax increases. So, yeah.
So, without further ado, Glenn and David's show.
I'm not so sure we should have both microphones on at the same time. It's kind of deadly. I don't I don't envy that as a radio guy. Are all of you familiar with Washington Policy Center? It's a nonprofit public policy think tank. For those of you who don't know what that means, we come across issues from a free market perspective, and we try and come up with our researchers from very specific research areas. In our case, we focus on budget and taxes, healthcare, the environment, agriculture, transportation, small business, worker rights, and education. And we focus on those issues. Occasionally, we go outside of our area, so to speak. But for the most part, we focus like a laser beam, as Michael would like to say. And we focus on those issues, and we try to provide solutions from a free market, individual liberty kind of perspective. And we make policy recommendations. People in Olympia either take our recommendations or not. They call our researchers to testify for legislation from time to time, which is helpful. And sometimes they take our ideas and run with them. For example, earlier this year, well, I guess it was the end of last year, we recommended a sales tax cut. There hasn't been a sales tax cut since 1982 in this state. And if you look at the state revenue without tax increases, our state revenue has increased 75% since the 2009-11 biennium, I believe. And in that time, inflation was 17%. So don't let somebody tell you, oh, yeah, but still, there's this, inflation. Yeah, inflation's big, 17%, but our overall revenue grew by 75%. And yet, the debate in Olympia, for the most part, has been about increasing taxes, not reducing taxes. Now, what would make one of the great banes of Washington State is supposed to be our regressive tax structure, right? So what would make it less regressive? Really quickly. Less regressive. Cutting the tax, right? I mean, just cut the tax. Automatically, more people can buy more with their own money. But while there were a couple of legislators, including the Senate Minority Leader, Senator Schessler, who proposed legislation to cut the sales tax, that has not been the debate in Olympia. The debate in Olympia is about the increasing taxes, the various taxes. In fact, the warning I got, the little alert on my phone, right before we walked on stage here was from Senator John Braun of Centralia, who was issuing a statement regarding Senate Bill 5993, which would make changes to the state's Model Toxics Control Act, including a tax increase on nearly 60% on certain petroleum products. And of course, that's aimed right up here at the refinery jobs here. And having worked at the refinery when I was in my, just out of high school and in early college days, I know that those jobs pay really well. They're more dangerous than some other jobs because of the kind of work that you're doing, but they also pay really well, and they allow people to provide for their families, and they've been and they provide energy for a lot of people in Seattle who apparently don't realize that they need energy. So that tends to be a challenge. It's kind of like we had some Seattle politicians that were making trying to make sure that people in agribusiness in Washington State would be sure to report if they were involved with slavery or any of their business associates were involved with slavery. And I don't know how many of you are involved in agribusiness, but some were offended on the east side of the state. And they, ironically, in the districts where some of these things were being proposed, there was a bunch of human trafficking busts in their districts, not in the farming district. So agriculture is, a $10.6 billion in revenue for Washington, 164,000 jobs, more than Microsoft and Amazon combined. One of the reasons why the Washington Policy Center is involved and made a commitment to studying agriculture policy in Washington State and trying to encourage it to be more directed by the people actually involved is because we're committed to the whole state. there's seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding between the urban parts of the state and the rural parts of the state, and we're trying to help out with that. But back to the tax issue. The question is which tax, right? We were talking just beforehand, and well, I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but it's tough to keep track of all the different taxes that have been proposed. The income tax on capital gains has been a big one because there's this great argument going on that it's not really an income tax, okay? Now, Washington Policy Center has run a number of ads throughout the state and in the Seattle Times and in the Tacoma News Tribune and in other print publications pointing out the fact that the capital gains income tax is an income tax. And proponents of the tax have said things like, well, that's that free market group, the Washington Policy Center, saying that. Critics, yes, they say that, but we say it's an excise tax. Who's to say? Who's to say, really? I mean, it's he said, she said. Well, the IRS says it's an income tax. In a letter to Congressman Newhouse, when he asked for clarification, they said, you asked if a capital gains tax is an income tax or an excise tax. It is an income tax, period. I put a column up by our budget researcher Jason Mercier up there for you to take home with you, and also these great magazines that we publish quarterly. There's a number of copies there. I hope you will take them home, and don't just take it home and set it next to the porcelain throne and forget about it. But you can also, if you're not going to read it, but you know of somebody who could, or the doctor's office, or the gas station, or the tire lobby, or whatever it happens to be, take it, distribute it, and let's get more information in the hands of more people. So the IRS says it's an income tax. So does the Revenue Department of every other state in the union. And the Revenue Department of Washington State has called it an income tax. The nonpartisan staff that describes the bill in Olympia makes references to income taxes and zero references to excise taxes. Now, why does this matter? Because if they can get one income tax in, they can get them all in. And the goal isn't the money. The goal is to get a court case that will then challenge the notion that it's unconstitutional to have a graduated income tax of any kind in Washington State. And the hope is that the courts would overturn 85 plus years of precedent and the votes, 10 votes among the people of Washington saying no to any form of income tax whatsoever. How do we know that that's part of the motivation? Well, we just had a lawsuit with the city of Seattle settled where they had to turn over a couple of documents to us, including a legal memo from the city attorney, where they talked about the possibility of Seattle proposing a local income tax. And the city attorney said, you can't. It's unconstitutional and illegal because the legislature specifically prohibits it. And P.S., it doesn't matter if you call it an excise tax, it's still an income tax. And the label you put on it doesn't matter because courts have said it. This label thing is not the prohibition. The prohibition is on the actual fact of the tax. So Seattle very clearly set out to try to create a way to get this in court and challenge it and try to get the courts to do what they were unable to persuade the people's representatives to do or the people to do, which is to impose an income tax. And then we have things like the low carbon fuel standard. There's a promise that it's going to make fuel more affordable. It's going to be better than ever, cheaper. We're going to save some money on it. And then you have to ask yourself, why would you have to force people to do things that would give you better fuel for less money, right? You don't have to force people to buy a better product that's cheaper. So there should be some concern there. You look at the experience of California, which our great researcher on the environmental issues, Todd Myers, has pointed out. In California, after various low-carbon mandates and renewables mandates, the prices of fuel went up by a considerable amount per kilowatt hour. I have the exact numbers here. I can share with you. Oh, here we go. let's see. The University of Chicago found renewable energy mandates increased costs 7 years after adopting. The average retail electricity prices were 11% higher. After 12 years, it was 17% higher. The California renewable mandate saw residential electricity rates increase 3.9 cents per kilowatt hour. During that time, California had replaced all kinds of electricity generated from natural gas and nuclear with solar, hydro, and some wind. The city of Seattle has reduced their wind power by 75%, 4-1. And the question is, would the Seattle City Council pay more in order to buy fewer renewables if that were the case? So there's a carbon tax proposed in the Senate, a plan that would end up, it would be a 6 cent per gallon gas tax increase, and then because of the carbon fee attached, it would ultimately mean, I want to say it ends up to be about a 17 cents per gallon increase in fuel. All of this starts to add up to be real money. And we haven't even gotten to the local levy lid request. The state raised state property taxes for the so-called McCleary fix in order to put more money into education. And they made a deal. They said, we're going to increase the state portion of the property tax, and we're going to cap the local property taxes. And that way, because the courts ruled that that education's a paramount duty of the state, we have to pay for basic education, the levies that are implemented by localities should be limited to certain extras. Well, now there's a big push because in many districts, double-digit pay increases that were unsustainable given their budgets were passed, and there were promises made, and now they find themselves in need of a bailout, and they want to renege on that promise that was made just a couple of years ago. In fact, the school superintendent said, well, promises from past legislatures don't mean anything because, after all, this is a new legislature. But it's the same old deal, and the question is, are people who are eager in an environment where the overall budget has increased several $billion, as I said, 75% since 2009, with 17% inflation, with bigger budgets than ever before, without any tax increase, are the people that just said no to 2 tax increases in the last election, even though they did endorse Democrats, by and large. One party now controls both houses of the legislature and the governor's office, so they got a big nod of approval versus Republicans, but it wasn't just that message. The other message was no to the soda tax, no to the carbon tax. And just like that, we have a very similar carbon tax being proposed in Olympia, along with a slew of other taxes. So the big question will be, is that overreach, or is it not overreach? And we'll talk about that, I'm sure. Anyway, I'd rather let Glenn, who has probably, I love reading about Glenn. I was really excited that he was going to be here because nobody makes me laugh more than Glenn Morgan when it comes to state politics. And it's not just that magnificent head of hair. It's how irritated so many people get with just the mention of his name, you know. He's like one of those boogeymen, you know, or Kaiser Soze. You whisper the name and there's a fear involved, and it all comes down to that list of people. So I'm gonna let Glenn do his monologue, and then we'll talk together.
All right, we'll see if we can get the mics not to interfere here. I was actually really excited. I've been when David was a talk show host, I've been on his show many times. He was always generous at letting me come on and talk about the issues around the state. So I was very excited actually to have the opportunity to be on stage. This is the first time I think we've ever actually been on stage together at all. Yeah, so anyway, we're going to have an opportunity for you to ask questions. I'm actually more interested in what you are interested in and what you would ask about than in what I have to say, but hopefully I have to say something that'll keep you awake and interested for a while. I wanted to first point out, I'm the Executive Director of the Citizens Alliance for Property Rights, and although this is a little late notice, some of you hopefully already know about this, but we do have a banquet on Saturday and a workshop in Tukwila in case you're interested. It's mostly focused on climate change. but also focused on the judicial climate of Washington, the business climate of Washington. We have some great speakers. Mark Morano, if you ever heard of the Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, he's the author of that. Anyway, it's a politically incorrect event, period, all day in Tukwila, and we have a lot of great speakers. There's some handouts. Roger, if you want to raise your hand back there, our local CAPER chapter chair, if we have some flyers out there if you want some more information on it. I really encourage you, if you are interested and you have the ability to get down to Tukwila, it will be a really good event. Secondly, I also have my website where I write, and that is entirely mine, so nobody actually can constrain what I write about, is wetogovern.com. And I'd encourage you to go there to look at some of the things I write about. As David mentioned, I do get a lot of angry feedback from certain categories of people. I actually went to a hearing a couple days ago to speak against a tax increase, a proposed boondoggle, guaranteed future disaster in Thurston County, that they were going to propose with, which has always had a history of incompetence when it comes to building new buildings. And I went there to speak against it. And the funny thing I found out was there was a whole bunch of people showed up. And I got up and I did my presentation, and a couple friends of mine also did theirs. And I was told later that a bunch of people who were going to speak in favor of it decided they wouldn't do it. And so I always am encouraged by that. And the more I think standing up and speaking is that about these things and confronting with the truth about what's going on, I think it's very important. From a legislative standpoint, I think that I've been told by many legislators on the more conservative persuasion that this is probably one of the worst legislative sessions when it comes to, in recent memory, maybe since 2003 or 1993, depending on how you look at it, when it comes to your freedom or your liberties. There's a lot of bad bills that did die, and usually they propose about 3,000 bills, and then only about 50 end up making it through. Too bad we couldn't constrain that, maybe winnow it down a little bit more, but there were a lot of bad bills that proposed in Olympia, and really part of the reason why you see this surge is you did have a change in control in the Senate, where it went from a nominally controlled majority caucus that was mostly controlled by Republicans, just barely, with Tim Sheldon being the Democrat who joined with the Republicans, since he votes more Republican than most Republicans. And then you actually had a shift of a number of Democrat legislators in the House, and with the Democrats in control of the governor, they basically had the ability to kind of run from a partisan standpoint almost any bill they wanted through the legislature and get signed by the governor, which is why you saw this increase in a lot of what I would consider a lot more radical bills, more hostile to freedom, and certainly hostile to your pocketbook. And they always say in Olympia that your freedoms and your pocketbook are never safe when the legislature is in session, and that's particularly true right now. And now we are coming to the end of the session, but the bad news is we're likely to have a special session extended further for another 30 days. And some of you may ask why. After all, one party controls both houses. What is there to disagree on? But they still haven't come up with what the final budget's going to be, and really the main thing they're going to do for that last 30 days is try to figure out how much money they can extract from you and everyone else that lives in the state. So that, and which special interests they're going to reward in that process. And so that's probably the biggest debate that's really, it's coming down to now, another $4.5 billion for the taxes they want to bring in. I do think it's important to remember that no matter how much tax dollars you give to bureaucrats or politicians in Olympia, it is never going to be enough. It never is. And just to use some local examples that apply to this national case, and why I say that, and I feel very comfortable in saying that, is the education increase. There's been over 8 years, the education funding from the state's doubled in the state. And they had this huge increase, and a lot of the districts, Tacoma being one that really stands out, but there's other school districts that really gave teachers a substantial raise. Now, I was on a school board for 5 years myself. My wife's a public school teacher, although she's not in the union. And they gave this big increase, and there were several superintendents around the state who were fighting against the increase. They said it's ridiculous, it's not gonna, we can't sustain it. Theoretically, the left-leaning folk like sustainability. That's true in theory, except when it comes to budgets, sustainability is always out the door. And so they wanted to have a pay increase and a cost increase that was unsustainable by any measurement. And so within 2 years now, numerous school districts are suddenly running into complete financial and fiscal insolvency, to all, Tacoma being one that really stands out in my mind. And we just gave the largest increase ever in the history of the state of Washington to education. And what the heck has it been for? And another thing, and this is worth illustrating, it's out of the Kent School District here a couple years ago. They had it was actually last year, they had a levy. And the superintendent was pushing this levy. Now, many of you know there's a lot of, you had the assessor here talk about the levy increases, right, in the county. And what happened is several people in the finance department in the Kent School District said, hey, listen, we can't, we're misrepresenting the financial state of the district. So the superintendent fired those people, of course, and they put it on the ballot, and they said, let's get this in, we need to save our programs. They passed the levy, good for them. School district gets all the money they want now from the citizens of Kent, and unfortunately, about I think 3 weeks later, they laid off 250 teachers and shut down a bunch of programs. And then suddenly the citizens thought, what did we just vote for? And then it comes out that they had lied. The superintendent very specifically colluded with a couple school district members. This all came out in records requests later to falsify the finances to the public so that they could justify passing the levy. Now, even in Kent, that actually stood out as something that was not a positive reflection on good government locally. And so the taxpayers in Kent rejected all the other proposals that actually they had one for public safety that was fairly reasonable, but they basically shot everything down after that. So just because it's in King County doesn't mean irrational people live there. And it was a reflection of what I think people are seeing. Now there's a great distrust among people who I think are basically fairly apathetic most of the time, but when it starts to impact them like that in the city of Kent, people start to wake up to what's going on. And one of the stories that I want to leave you with before we go to questions, and it's a little bit, it's something I haven't seen in Olympia so much, but I'm being told by a lot of people in Olympia, and I've witnessed it myself walking around the campus, there's a much greater level of activism of people coming down there in large numbers opposing legislation more than what we've seen, at least in recent times. And I'll give you 3 examples that I think are interesting. I oftentimes refer to government bureaucrats, right, as the dream destroyers in our lives, right? They exist primarily to create a bureaucracy. The bigger it gets, it can destroy more and more of your dreams. And it's not just your planning department in Whatcom County, which certainly merits the Dream Destroyer Award in most years, but also these other approaches, and here's a couple of examples. One was the hairdressers. Basically, and Dave's pretty familiar with this because it was quite a scene in January where the Democrats proposed some legislation that would basically wipe out the ability of hairdressers to reserve seats where they could, at salons where they could run their businesses. So it was basically destroying their businesses. And it was going to affect 20,000, 25,000 hairdressers across Washington State. And actually, the proposal was going to affect a lot more people than just them. But they were quite organized. Now, if any of you know hairdressers, they don't actually typically fit the profile of people who vote Republican or conservative. However, they just discovered that the people they do vote for certainly don't care about them and have no concern about their future dreams or ambitions and have no hesitation at destroying everything that they've worked for their whole lives in one swipe of the pen in Olympia. And I refer this to you and say it this way because that's how they described it to me. And they came back from Olympia, several of these people that I talked to, saying, I feel like I'm a Republican now. You know, what just happened, you know? And the second group that I've had a similar reaction, they were actually in the Capitol 2 days ago, yesterday, were Asians for Equality, which was a big group that got organized in opposition to I-1000, which was basically trying to bring back race-based affirmative action for Washington State, which has been removed from policy by government since a citizens initiative. This is one of Iman's first initiatives, actually back in the late 90s. And this group got organized. People I've never met before, but it was mostly Chinese heritage, Vietnamese heritage, a lot of Asians in the Redmond, Mercer Island, Seattle, kind of Kirkland area. A lot of them were high-tech computer programmers. And they recognized that this law was explicitly used to target them to eliminate their job prospects and their ability to actually participate in all kinds of areas of society the way this initiative was written. And so they came down to oppose it, and many of them contacted me, and I've had many members now of that group have contacted me, and they said, you know, most of us probably thought we were Democrat before. And we've come down here and come to realize that Democrats absolutely hate us and actually have no concern for anything that we care about. And that's a whole nother group that suddenly you could see the shift going on in the conversations and some of the meetings I had with them. The third one that was interesting was the anti-vaccine group, which is kind of a split group. There's some people who consider themselves more libertarian in there. There's some people that are more left-leaning. And I don't care what you believe about that exactly, but the way the Olympia has approached it was you no longer have the ability to opt out, right? That was the legislation that was being pushed. And whether you agree with them or not, especially I met a bunch of these people that were more left-leaning, they were shocked that their greatest defender in Olympia wasn't a single Democrat, but the greatest defender was Matt Shea from Spokane, considered the most conservative guy in Olympia. And a bunch of these people who had never in their life would ever define themselves as conservative, Republican, or anything close to that spectrum said, I can't believe that the only people that care about my freedom or my choice is the most conservative person here in Olympia, and I think I'm no longer a Democrat. And that was interesting to hear people say. I've actually never heard so many people tell me that. Now, I don't know what that necessarily results in, but years ago, when I've come up to Whatcom County before and mentioned this, that big government, the more it grows, creates a constituency opposed to it. Because the more experience interaction you have with government, the more you realize that you're the last concern that they have. I mean, customer service, which is they try to use that language sometimes, but they really don't care. If you've ever gone to meetings of bureaucrats when they aren't really thinking they're taxpayers watching, you should hear how they talk about you, or how they write about you sometimes, and I've exposed with emails in the past. And I don't know if this is a backlash building in Washington State. I don't know if what we see happening is this overreach that I feel like has occurred in Olympia and Seattle in particular, whether that's going to change the ways a lot of people who might otherwise have viewed themselves as more on the liberal side of the spectrum, whether they're going to change how they view the world. But I feel like something like that's building. And the final thing I want to leave with you, and it's not the legislature specifically, but its big cultural impact in Seattle has been this documentary. How many of you have heard of the documentary Seattle's Dying? Okay. That has changed Seattle, in my opinion, because what you've seen happen in Seattle now is a lot of people, you can believe the rhetoric only so long, but eventually you're going to start believing your lying eyes, right? And when you go down to Seattle and it looks worse than third world slums that you might have seen somewhere else in the world, and you're wondering what exactly is going on in Seattle, and you can't go to the parks without stepping on a needle, and you can't go around with just inescapable, bizarre behavior, all throughout the city. Even people who live in Seattle have to actually start to recognize that there's something wrong, and to see their political leadership try to tell them that they're delusional, they're racist, they whatever, they're greedy. How dare you even think that there's anything wrong with filling up the streets with homeless people, with drug addicts basically, and why don't you just let them steal everything that you own? That kind of stuff. I think it's really it's a real significant change that's going on in Seattle as well. It doesn't mean you're converting a whole bunch of people to suddenly become, read Hayek's Road to Serfdom and suddenly change their view of the world. But I certainly see a change that I've not seen so dramatically in places I wouldn't expect it. And so, yes, it's a terrible session in Olympia, a lot of delusion, a lot of really terrible people that should never be allowed to run anything, let alone be a legislator in Olympia or down there. I think that it's up to us to expose these people and show just how nutty and crazy they really are. But it's what's happened, and usually there's some kind of pushback on that, and we're going to see how that goes. The session's not over yet, so I'm sure the circus will continue for a little while. With that, I think we could probably open it up for Q&A. If I stand far enough from you, do you want to see if you can turn that on without too much feedback? Yeah, a warning in advance.
It's working so far.
Okay,
there we go.
perfect. All right, so we'll take questions from the audience. The only thing I'm going to mention is that please ask questions, don't make speeches, and leave your resume, portion of it, to a relatively defined amount. And it's not because we don't care. I love to sit here and listen to you talk, but it's really about your fellow audience members who may also have questions. I'll take point. Yes, sir.
Let's say it's all but certain that things like the capital gains income tax will be enacted. What if it's subsequently overturned by a court case or by an initiative that would be the 11th or the 12th initiative of its kind in a row? What if it's subsequently overturned? Does
what happens?
Well, I mean, do you want to take
It would be challenged immediately, and they would have, yeah.
Sure.
The question was about what happens if they pass a capital gains income tax. What would happen if, say, the court threw it out, or if the people threw it out? It would be challenged right away. I don't know the answer of whether. I don't think they'd be able to spend the money that it was that it claimed that it was going to fund, because once it's challenged, it would be on hold, I think. So, I mean, I could be wrong. The person to ask that question to is probably a guy like Rob McKenna, who's challenging the income tax in Seattle. But Jason Mercier would know probably as well, so you can ask him. But just off my semi-educated guess is that it would be on hold, and they would have to wait and see. And I'm 100% sure that there would be a court challenge right away. I'm also sure that the people, if an initiative were to pass, although you and I both know they'll just attach an emergency clause to whatever piece of legislation that this is, so the initiative would have to wait a while. But the people would say no again, because they've said no 11 times or 10 times since 1932.
And one thing that does happen, I think, when people watch, they see things around them with how their tax dollars are squandered, wasted, or just incompetence, it actually isn't encourage them to vote for more tax dollars, even in Seattle. So it's, I think that would change things.
And one other weird phenomenon here is we're talking about taxes, and I mean, I didn't even mention the $1 billion payroll tax.
Right.
It's $1 billion, and yet it's like, oh yeah, there's also that other $1 billion tax over there.
Yeah.
There's just so many being proposed, you just lose track.
All right. Yes, sir.
Yes, the handout that you gave me, that looks like a lot of money, Glenn. Does it go to your operating expenses?
Okay, that's a great question. I did a handout here that has 41 and counting. I had to keep updating it because every day it changes usually, but 41 and counting people that have been fined by the Public Disclosure Commission or in some other way had to pay a settlement for failing to disclose their usually campaign finance information. And 41 people that I think have taken me off their Christmas card list. But the one thing about it is, if you total that up, those fines, there were two questions there. It's about $500,000 in fines so far. There's quite a few more coming. But all that money gets sent to the general fund, the state of Washington, and gets squandered along with the rest of your money. So I don't get any of it. I purely do that for the joy of exposing the truth, and actually, to some extent, I don't mind showing the absurdity of the campaign finance laws. That's always been part of the fun, too. Yes, sir, I told you I would call you next. I'll call on. Yep.
Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate that your wife is not a member of the union, the teachers union. I'm wondering, by your opinion, is there any possibility that a voter initiative could, in this state, could potentially make membership in government membership in unions illegal?
Okay, so the question is, first a recognition that my wife's not in the union. She's happy she's not in the union too. But, and the other question is, can you do an initiative that makes membership in government, or an initiative, sorry, that makes membership in government unions illegal? I think that would be a difficult initiative to survive a legal challenge. You already have legal Supreme Court decisions that have said that it must be voluntary, meaning that you can leave. The Janus decision and some of these others you're seeing the Freedom Foundation, where I used to work, the Washington Policy Center as well, is working on encouraging people who work in the public sector unions to leave those unions voluntarily. And in fact, by the way, that's also what's ending the Washington State Bar Association. Which will no longer exist coming up. So for that, because of that same decision. So, which is a great thing. That's not a great place.
But the same constitutional question would apply: is
right.
If you have freedom of association, it also means you have the freedom to belong to the union if you want to.
Yeah, so I don't know that they can make it illegal. Now, even though Franklin Delano Roosevelt said originally, right, government unions were never, never something that could be allowed. I just don't know if that would actually pass. The problem is it has to be challenged in the Washington State Supreme Court, and there's a lot of Supreme Court.
You can even set the legality aside, though. I mean, unions, by and large, are popular in this state. So they poll very well. Unions are generally popular, but that doesn't mean that everybody thinks that a union should be able to force someone to belong. And frankly, it wouldn't even matter if if the majority of the people think it's okay to force somebody to pay for the politics of a third party. That's why we have individual rights, not rights determined by majority rule. So, but anyway, it wouldn't pass legal muster, and it wouldn't pass just from the will of the people.
Even as much as we might like that, but.
One more thing. Considering that the teachers union is a stage of their legal strikes, is it possible to say that you guys didn't follow the rules, therefore your union broke the rules, therefore your unions are out?
So the question is, because the teachers union did have a number of illegal strikes, and they did quite a few of them actually, and they've threatened a lot more, is it possible for you to say that then because you've done something illegal that your organization is going to be removed? And I find that that's probably an impractical result. I don't think you're going to get that result. One of the things you have to look at is you still have to, as much as I might really have a low-level respect for the Supreme Court in Washington State, they still are the Supreme Court, and unless you have something federally, which is always a good idea, by the way, given the choice, go to federal court. But if you have to be in state court, which you probably would be on that, the result isn't going to probably work out too well for you. And it's easy to say those things. It's very expensive to fund litigation. And as somebody who's been sued quite a few times by our friends on the other side, it does cost money eventually. And so you have to pick and choose. You may not always get a chance to choose who's suing you, but at least you get to choose which litigation you're going to actively take. So Larry, I see your hand in the back.
Yeah, I for the last 8 years tried to get remote testimony, and I'm absolutely convinced the lobbyists are opposing that every chance we can get. So what can we do to get remote testimony so we get the public down there testifying instead of the lobby?
Well, the good news is remote test. Oh, the question was, he said, I've been working on trying to get remote testimony in Olympia. They resist it. It drives me crazy. What do we have to do to get that? Well, we also at the Washington Policy Center have been recommending that for a number of years and contacting the legislature and urging them and trying to persuade them to do so. The Senate has made it a permanent part. The House is going to adopt remote testimony, so you have a victory finally. So remote testimony is coming. I mean, a lot of the argument for it is the snow and the pass, but really when you think about how long, I'd rather drive from Yakima to Olympia than Bellingham to Olympia, and I live in Tacoma. So it's a nightmare. Let's go to the young lady over there with her hand up.
Have you found any Republican politicians guilty of political campaign violations?
Sure. So the question is, have you found any Republican politicians guilty of campaign finance violations? And the answer is yes, and they also had complaints filed on them. I didn't file those complaints. I didn't need to. The other side filed them as well. So, in fact, when they went to pass what they nicknamed the Stop Glenn Morgan bill last year, they had to suspend the rules on the floor because you're not allowed to vote on a bill that personally benefits you. And since they couldn't get a quorum of people that didn't have campaign finance complaints against them, they had to suspend the rule so they could even pass the law. So I was quite entertained by that. And actually, I did want a lot of those things changed. And so I just found that if only one party wants to change something, right, then, and the Republicans had largely wanted to change the campaign finance laws in the state, then they were afraid to do it because every time they proposed it, they were attacked and said you want to destroy transparency and stuff. So what you really had to do is make sure that both parties got a chance to experience the joys and wonders of Washington State's campaign finance laws in its fullest experience. And so by doing that, there suddenly became a bipartisan objective to actually fix the law.
Glenn, that brings up something you and I were talking about earlier, which was you just said, I don't have to file those complaints because there's people filing complaints against the Republicans anyway on that, but we were talking about conservative politicians and specifically one state senator who's been the focus of national and international news for the past several days because of some unfortunate comments about nursing and playing cards, while nursing. And, you read the context, and she was speaking about a rural hospital in her district with 6 patients, and then she says, okay, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. And then that's not enough. I got a job, okay, I'll job shadow. Even though her mom was a nurse as well, they're still claiming she knows nothing about nursing. It's like, well, God forbid anybody says anything, foolish in the heat of the moment. because we've got the virtual pitchforks out. But I was trying to think, when do you recall a left-leaning state politician getting national headlines sustained like that? I just don't recall it.
No, never. I mean, and you even had, not that far away, last session, you had Senator Ranker out of the friendly San Juans, out of Orcas Island, get in trouble for...
Very friendly San Juans.
very friendly San Juans. But basically get truly exposed by a former director in the Fish and Wildlife Department for threatening her that he would cut the budget if she didn't have a relationship with him.
It was atrocious.
I mean, it was unbelievable,
Yeah.
right? And so something like that, there isn't, one of the things when you talk about lack of equal coverage is that didn't make national news. That didn't, even though that was pretty atrocious. And now he did resign, eventually. But when I really started looking at him, I even caught him committing excise tax fraud on his property and reported that to the Department of Revenue. But they don't, there isn't an equal attention usually based on party affiliation from what I've seen on some of these violations. Yeah, and poor Senator Walsh.
Remember Troy Kelly, the state auditor, where Watkins was a Republican candidate. He brought the information forward and said, hey, looks like there's a criminal problem here. And he had the endorsement withdrawn from major state newspaper because, hey, you know what, you brought up this negative information, that's really bad. They didn't look at the information, they just condemned him for bringing it up. And then, of course, later it was, I can't believe this, our state auditor is going to jail.
Yeah.
But,
the
the playing field is not even, let me put it that way.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate because it also destroys, that doesn't mean that Republicans don't do bad things or commit crimes themselves. But unfortunately, if you have the tame media or the traditional media who decides that we're going to only cover problems with one party and then we're going to treat the other side very differently, that's a problem. The Attorney General does the same thing. The Attorney General actually, in these campaign finance cases, because there were so many of them going on at the same time, he would actually fundraise for the people that he supposedly was suing. The Spokane County Democrats and others, he would go there and help them fundraise to pay the fine that his office was going to have to impose on them later. But when a Republican group would do it, he would go issue press release after press release after press release about how terrible they were. And I think that's unequal treatment, in my opinion, even if the AG thinks that's how things are done. And so I really think that that's the kind of stuff that it's worth highlighting. And if we had a more robust media out there, you would see it more. But it's up to us to report on that now. Yes, sir, Dick.
I'm just curious about individual tax increase. I've heard about the increase in the B&O tax, increase in the carbon tax, increase in the insurance premium tax, supposedly to create a firefighting fund. What's the status of some of those specific tax increases we're talking about? Because they're pretty major dollars.
It's funny. We're supposed to repeat the question, and he went through a list of taxes, and my mind's already lost them. He's carbon tax, the insurance premium tax, the B&O tax. Well, for me, most of these things are up in the air because the budget's not done yet.
Right.
So they're all hanging out there as tantalizing fruit. You might get all of them, or you might, well, I was going to say you might get none, but you're going to get some. I mean, there's been so many, I haven't even kept track of them all. And some of them that you're talking about, I was unaware of because I haven't tracked them all. So my guess is you'll know a lot more on Sunday, which is the last day of the legislature when the budget goes through. In the meantime, it's a wait and see.
And they may kick it over into the next special session on some of those. Well, they kind of sort them out, and that's I'm being told that's what's going to happen for sure. They'll have a special session, and then there'll be a lot of backroom arguing and deals over it.
You'll recall the last time there was the Senate Majority Coalition Caucus of Republicans and Democrats that had allied together. That was when the Republicans were so-called running the show in the Senate, but it was really a coalition. When they went into special session, even though that was a split chamber, there was all kinds of outrage that they were going into special session. Now you've got very strong majorities in both the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. And I'll be really curious to see where the outrage lies on going into a special session.
Or giving like Inslee an extra $3.5 million to handle his security team so that he can travel around and campaign in a guaranteed failure to campaign for the president. So, there's other things, little gems in there that are going on like that as well. So the question is our wonderful Governor Inslee pulling it at 0%? I'm not sure if he's hit 1% yet, but he is bouncing somewhere between 0 and 1%. To understand, there is a crowded field, and I'm not entirely sure if running on global climate change is the greatest threat to mankind, when that issue is always polled as one of the least important things to the average American voter. I'm not actually sure that that's the winning ticket, but I'm sure Inslee thought it was.
Payroll taxes seem to be quite popular lately. They take money out of people's paychecks. How is that not income tax?
It's a good question. It's a question for the lawyers.
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, payroll tax, they're popular these days. He's referring to, we got a 0.58 of 1% for the new payroll tax that would provide for long-term care, plus the family leave, the paid family leave payroll tax. It starts to add up to real money, and he's saying, how is that not an income tax? I'm sure there's a legal definition of that, probably something along the lines of, well, we're not taxing the income, we're taxing the paying of it, or something along those lines. But that would be something for the lawyers to parse. As far as how it feels in your wallet and on your paycheck, it'll feel remarkably similar.
There's really a lot of argument for the employer piece of it.
Right.
It's paid by the employer, but the part that comes out of the employee's paycheck.
Well, the new payroll tax has nothing. It's only the employee that's paying on the long-term care. It's only the employees that pay for that
And
tax.
ultimately, whether it's a B&O tax, a carbon tax, whatever, you pay. So they can say they're shifting it onto somebody here, the fees, the excise tax, you pay in the end. There's no way to avoid you paying. And the other thing, too, to remember is a lot of these taxes are set up and they supposedly have dedicated funds that they'll dump money into, like the Toxic Cleanup Fund and all these other things. And then when Olympia and the legislature and the bureaucrats decide that they need to sweep those funds, where they go through and they sweep all those funds out, that dedicated fund disappears, and the special purpose that it was supposed to be used for, now suddenly they're out of money, oh my God, and they need to raise taxes again to put the money back in. I just all time.
We didn't get to how the state's marching towards single-payer health care plan or government-run health care plan, but the state that has so mismanaged Western State Hospital that it got decertified at the federal level is moving toward greater management of all of our care.
Because they just do such a great job.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see that. Looks like we've got a time crunch there.
We got one more question back here, Charlie. So, all right, we'll take, yes, in the back row, yep. And then I'll ask you, Charlie. We're putting you last, though. So.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. I just wanted to ask you, particularly one, with all this talk about honorable taxpayers paying taxes, it seems like the great majority of people are. I'm interested to know, is there any idea with a majority or I would say half the people, a majority of people, okay, who do not pay taxes and have no idea what it means to become assimilated into the United States? I'm saying, how do politicians, whether if all this money, and there are monies that are expatriated, and there are all these social welfare programs, how does a politician or someone, or what are the ideas to tap the monies that are going out of this country that are never taxed to begin with by a lot of people, I would say a lot of people who do not pay taxes? Is there any ideas of how to capture that money?
You want to answer? You want to summarize that, or?
The question was basically how, is there any effort to try to tax money that is not currently being taxed but is being sent across borders, so to speak, to other countries, and is there an effort to try and at least collect the fair share, would that be the appropriate way to say it, the fair share in U.S. taxes on that? And I would say as a state policy group, everybody's paying the sales tax. In Washington State, you're not going to be avoiding other tax because even visitors here are going to end up paying a sales tax unless they go through the trouble of not paying that tax. But then the second thing I would just add is there are people who even people here illegally who would end up paying Social Security tax and other taxes, they just wouldn't end up being able to collect.
Because the only, I mean, I've heard at the federal level there's been some discussions in D.C. about finding ways to tax money like that, but at the state level, that's not really something the state would probably look at, and so that's really more of a federal question that they might look at.
Yeah.
Charlie.
Yeah. So, talk to you a little bit, if you can, about the expense of the AG's office and the expense of the governor's office when it comes to, you mentioned Western State Hospital, when it comes to being sued or settlements.
Oh, yeah.
What's been included in this year's budget compared to last year?
So the question is, talk about the increase in, you're talking about the lawsuit settlements, right? The tort settlements for, yeah. There is, actually, it wasn't really, it just said talk about the increase in the liability payments. And yeah, that's actually true. I'm not sure by biennium, but I know that I read about, it was like a 75%, 50% increase in payments by Washington State as tort claims against people who they had abused or through their incompetence had hurt. I know it's a surprise that it's only that much of an increase, but there's actually a pretty strict set of standards in order for you to qualify to sue the state of Washington for, you know, by negligence or it basically has to do with people that the state is supposed to be the guardian of, which is basically orphans, right? People, Western State Hospital, other
disabled
people.
individuals.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and so there's been a tremendous increase in payouts on this, and they don't. It doesn't appear to be without merit. I mean, they seem to be legitimately just egregious incompetence. I mean, I always equate incompetence with government. It means being very synonymous, but. It's just sometimes things reach a scale, right, where they even are noticed by people that don't necessarily view the world that way. And it's amazing to see how many problems like that. And those are oftentimes very tragic cases with a lot of human tragedy and horrible stories attached to them. And it's a lot more of that's occurring here. You know, and I just something like
there's a follow-up to that too, though. It's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
just the financial cost, as you point out. There's a human cost. I mean, I can think of in the last couple of years, there's been a disabled woman who was actually placed with her the suspect in her own rape, and she was left there when they finally found her. She was in a feces-filled room with numerous cigarette burns all over her body. I mean, it was just horrific abuse. There was a little kid that was sent back into an abusive home. His foster parents wanted to adopt him. There had multiple problems at home. Instead, he was sent back, and he was beaten so badly that he has permanent brain damage. And the foster parents, by the way, still adopted him. Just an amazing family. But he will never be, I think, over the age of 3 or 4 months, mentally speaking, because of the abuse. So these kinds of stories happen over and over again. There's the state payout issue, which is a challenge, a financial challenge, but there's also the challenge of what's the consequence, right? What's the consequence for the person who makes, not just people will make mistakes, and I don't want to lay the blame of one evil person's actions on the bureaucrat, but when a bureaucrat is faced with that and chooses to ignore it or doesn't do their job, you know, for example, the case of the Tacoma woman who suffered the burns, there was, there was claims that there was an inspection done. Well, there's just no way you can do an inspection and have this person stay in that home. So, those problems, in part come from, there is a way too much comfort in the executive branch that there's not going to be that accountability. You need people who, politicians and representatives of both parties willing to hold their own accountable, and specifically in Washington State, you need Democrats that are angry about it because, frankly, the executive branch has been controlled by Democrats for 37 years straight. So, yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to be partisan. I'm just saying, with 37 years, that's one party that has to just say, you know what, that can't happen anymore.
You know, and just as a final, looks like we're closing up here, but I just want to point out, too, one of the things I've oftentimes talked about as I've gone around the state is just pay attention to your local government. And, really do pay attention to what's happening. There was a story that came out just a couple weeks ago in Spokane, and I want to highlight it just as one of these classic examples. So in the state auditor's office, they caught an employee who had found a nice way to steal about $1.3 million. And from the taxpayers, and they discovered it last year during the election, but conveniently they waited and didn't actually say anything about it until this year after the election was over. But the employee, had found some way to, and it kind of encouraged me to go back and look through the state auditor's fraud reports, which is actually quite entertaining reading. If you ever want to just read it, it's a little, it actually is kind of entertaining, but. They had found a way to collude with a bunch of people, and they had passed I remember just a couple years ago, the county auditor there had said, hey, we don't even need audits anymore. I mean, our department is so great here. We really don't need audits. And the few that we get, we just pass with flying colors. And every year that they had passed with flying colors, they had this employee had been stealing on average $179,000 a year. It was, it was great, but they were passing every audit. It was great. And to do this person had to collude with 45 people. In order to do what they were doing is they were creating false claims, and then she would have a friend or a relative or somebody be the recipient of the claim check, and then she would let them take $300 and she'd get the other 100,000, right, or whatever it was. And it just seemed like a good plan at the time. And why would she not think that? She'd been doing it for 10 years, and nobody ever caught it. In fact, it was just an accident that they found that they caught the person. So I do think that there's a lot more by don't assume that somebody's paying attention to this. Don't assume that somebody else is going to actually solve it. You see something funny, start paying attention, dig into it. You never know what you find. And as much as they might say that it's the greatest, government entity around, you're going to probably find some things that are not exactly kosher there. So with that, I'll hand it over to Charlie.
Hopefully Glenn and David will stick around and talk to you individually if you have questions you want to ask them. We've got our assessor, Keith Wilnauer, here to answer questions. Ron's still here, Wiesen, Dave Uncles on the water. Anybody else that we had on stage? Thank you all for coming. We have a bit of a what I'm going to call, because he doesn't like it that way, a parting shot from Dick. Whatever his name is, Dick Donahue.
Hey, thanks, Charlie, for chairing it tonight. As the chair of Common Threads, we appreciate your being here. I did want to say that we have a group of really dedicated, probably about 15 or 20 people that meet at least twice a month to try to put these things together. And we're in a situation where if you'd like to join us, we have the meetings typically on the fourth Monday of every month, about 11:30 in the morning. I have a conference room in the back of my office. If you're interested in participating, give me a call, 733-1200. We'll be glad to put you on the list. The other thing is, if you have suggestions or ideas for us for topics that you would like to have us hold public forums on, we're not trying to get political necessarily, we're trying to be educational. And we think the point of view that we're trying to make is very important for people to understand. What we heard today from Glenn and Dave is just a good example of things that the average person is not aware of, is what's going on. We think it's important that people understand what's going on. Now, also, may be aware, many of you, I have 4 Mariners tickets and parking passes. I happen to have tickets, I think, for Monday the 13th, Tuesday the 14th, and that Friday, I think, is the 17th and the 18th of May. So if anybody's interested, you can call me. I'm not going to talk. I got them with me, but just call my office. Four tickets and a parking pass, and that's 13th, 14th of May, and that's a Monday and Tuesday anyway of that week. And then the Friday and Saturday, call me. I got those at the office, 733-1200. Be glad to share them with you. Thank you. Where'd you go, Charlie? Thank you, guys.